Silicon Valley, a place where ambition rises with every sunrise. And in 2021, a young engineer named Ethan Cole stepped into a world of innovation, unaware that his brilliance would draw shadows he could never escape. A place built on possibility, on code, on ideas strong enough to reshape the world and fragile enough to destroy the people behind them. Here, success is a currency, obsession is routine, and the cost of falling behind can feel heavier than failure itself. In this landscape of dazzling opportunity, of relentless pressure, a young engineer quietly rose through the ranks. His name was Ethan Cole, gifted, disciplined, precise. Someone whose talent didn't just turn heads, it carried an entire team forward. But before we learn who Ethan was, before we trace the last steps he ever took, there is a truth we cannot ignore, a truth that overshadows everything that follows. A steady pause, a shift in tone, darker, colder. Every year, thousands disappear across the United States. Most leave behind clues, footprints, a trail that leads somewhere. But once in a while, a disappearance emerges that defies every rule. No struggle, no evidence, no motive that makes sense. In 2021, in the heart of Palo Alto, a young engineer walked out of his office and vanished between two security cameras. No witnesses, no messages, no goodbye, just silence and a mystery that continues to haunt Silicon Valley. This is the story of Ethan Cole. A slow fade into the narrator's voice, steady, investigative. Ethan's disappearance is not defined by chaos. There was no commotion, no alarms, no calls for help. Just an ordinary Thursday evening, an elevator ride, a dimly lit lobby, and the cold glow of security footage capturing a man who appeared calm, focused, unaware that this would be the last time anyone would ever see him. There is no perfect crime, or so investigators often say, but what happened to Ethan Cole challenges that belief. Every detail, from the missing digital logs to the unexplained 17-minute gap in camera coverage to the absence of physical evidence, paints a case that refuses to reveal its truth. The deeper you go, the darker it becomes. Layers of pressure, workplace coercion, shifting alliances, and subtle manipulations that hint at a man trapped in a system far larger than himself. In the hours leading up to his disappearance, his world was unraveling, quietly, invisibly, behind glass walls and encrypted servers. And by the time anyone realized he was gone, the traces of his final moments had already begun to fade. Tonight, we step into that timeline. We examine who Ethan was, what he meant to those around him, and what shadows had been forming behind him long before the world noticed he was missing. This is not just a disappearance. It is a descent into a hidden world of ambition, fear, pressure, and silence. A story where every answer creates another question, and every possibility feels more unsettling than the last. Ethan Cole was born in a quiet suburb just outside Sacramento, far from the noise and speed that would one day define his life. He was the kind of child who took apart radios just to see how they worked, the kind of teenager who repaired neighbors' devices for fun, and the kind of young adult who believed that technology wasn't just a tool, but a language he spoke fluently. Those who knew him during his school years remembered a boy who was both brilliant and understated. He wasn't loud, he wasn't attention-seeking, he wasn't the kind of prodigy who wanted to be the center of a room. Instead, he blended into the edges, observing, thinking, analyzing. Every teacher who crossed paths with him shared a similar reflection. Ethan didn't try to be exceptional, he simply was. When he moved to Palo Alto in his early 20s, he did so with a quiet confidence. He carried a backpack, a second-hand laptop he'd repaired himself, and a hope that he could build something meaningful. What he didn't know was how quickly the world would notice him. Inside the fast-growing tech startup where he was hired, Ethan's reputation rose almost immediately, not because he pushed for recognition, but because his work was impossible to ignore. He could troubleshoot complex systems faster than senior developers. He could trace errors through dense layers of architecture that others avoided. He didn't just complete tasks, he refined them, optimized them, elevated them. Within months, he became the quiet backbone of several internal products, tools that dozens of employees relied on every single day, processes that seemed invisible yet critical, systems that appeared seamless, largely because of him. Coworkers described Ethan as focused, meticulous, and humble, someone who showed up early, left late, and rarely took breaks, someone who sat at the same desk, drank the same black coffee, and listened to the same soft electronic music that helped him concentrate. He felt stable, grounded, predictable. But beneath that calm surface, subtle cracks were forming. At first, no one recognized the signs. A shift in his posture during long meetings, a heaviness around his eyes after weeks of intense deadlines, a noticeable quiet that even his closest colleagues couldn't quite explain. 50-plus employees depended on Ethan's work every day, and leadership valued him as one of their strongest young engineers. But in a company growing faster than its infrastructure could support, brilliance often comes with a cost. Ethan was constantly approached for fixes, updates, improvements, emergencies. And every time he solved one problem, 3 more appeared. He began absorbing responsibilities that were never officially assigned to him. He covered gaps left by senior teams. He patched up crises before they reached the executive level. And he did it without complaint, because that was who he was. Reliable, steady, a quiet foundation in a building designed to move too quickly. But pressure has a way of revealing fractures long before collapse becomes visible. Around this time, people noticed moments where Ethan seemed distracted, not unfocused, not careless, just distant. There were days when he stared at his screen without typing, fingers hovering over the keyboard as though frozen by thoughts he couldn't shake. There were evenings when he stayed long after everyone else had left, not because he wanted to, but because something seemed to be weighing on his mind. His friends outside the workplace recalled missed messages, canceled weekend plans, a shift from cheerful conversations to vague responses. It wasn't dramatic, it was subtle. The kind of slow, creeping change that only becomes obvious in hindsight. Inside the office, whispers began to circulate about growing internal pressures, new leadership, new expectations, new dynamics that disrupted the previously calm environment. And in the center of those dynamics, a name began to surface, quietly at first, then more frequently. Rebecca Hale, the HR manager. Her presence, her decisions, her influence, all slowly weaving into the trajectory of Ethan Cole's life, long before anyone understood the impact she would have. As Ethan's responsibilities increased, as deadlines tightened, as internal tensions grew more noticeable, Rebecca's involvement in staff operations became stricter, more hands-on, and far more personal than before. Ethan, who once navigated the workplace with quiet ease, now found himself under a microscope he didn't ask for. Meetings that felt less like check-ins and more like evaluations. Feedback that sounded encouraging on the surface but carried an undertone he couldn't quite define. A shift was happening, small at first, almost invisible, as though some unseen current was slowly pulling him into deeper waters. His coworkers continued to admire him. Leadership continued depending on him. But Ethan himself began to change. Something wasn't right. And though no one could pinpoint it then, the early traces of his downfall had already begun to appear. This was the beginning. The quiet arc before the storm. The subtle unraveling of a life built on discipline, logic, and quiet brilliance. A life that in just a few months would slip into a darkness no one saw coming. In early 2021, the company was growing faster than anyone anticipated. New hires filled every corner of the office, new projects piled onto existing ones, and the internal pressure that had quietly existed for months finally began revealing its sharpest edges. And at the center of this shifting landscape stood Ethan, steady, dependable, carrying more than anyone realized. This was the period when she became impossible to ignore. Rebecca Hale, the HR manager. Her role had always been administrative, onboarding new employees, organizing schedules, managing personnel issues. But around this time, her presence began to reach beyond paperwork and into the daily rhythm of the engineering teams. She walked the floors more often. She lingered near workstations. She attended meetings she wasn't required to join. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the tone of the office began to change. For reasons that remain unclear even today, Rebecca's attention began centering on Ethan. At first, it seemed harmless. She asked him about his workload. She offered to help relieve pressure. She praised his problem-solving abilities, his stability, his commitment. Coworkers observed these interactions with a mix of amusement and curiosity, assuming it was simply HR encouraging a high performer. But what began as professional interest evolved into something more intrusive. Over time, Rebecca inserted herself into details of Ethan's work that had nothing to do with HR. She questioned his time allocations, his project priorities, his communication patterns. She told him certain tasks mattered more than others, even when those tasks contradicted engineering leadership direction. She insisted on private check-in meetings multiple times a week, meetings that left Ethan unusually tense, quiet, unsettled. According to internal emails later reviewed by investigators, Rebecca frequently requested updates on Ethan's hours, his deadlines, and even his physical presence in the building. On the surface, they appeared routine, but when viewed together, they painted a pattern, a growing level of control over a single employee that defied HR's typical boundaries. Coworkers began noticing Ethan's posture change during these interactions. The once grounded engineer who operated with calm confidence now seemed wary, hesitant, as though he was constantly bracing for something. He spent more time isolated at his desk, less time conversing with teammates. He stayed later into the evening, when the building grew quiet and the environment finally gave him space to breathe. Leadership, overwhelmed by scaling demands, failed to see the subtle distress building in the background. And Rebecca's influence only grew stronger. Around this same time, a senior manager named Daniel became increasingly involved with Ethan's work. Not in a collaborative way, but in a manner coworkers described as intrusive, supervisory, and unnecessary. Daniel frequently questioned Ethan's decisions, sometimes in front of others. He reassigned tasks without explanation. He challenged Ethan's technical choices despite lacking engineering expertise. This added a new layer of pressure, a pressure that seemed to tighten around Ethan from both directions. HR monitoring his movements and a senior manager scrutinizing his work. Emails later uncovered would show inconsistencies between Daniel's written instructions and Ethan's performance reviews, documents that contradicted each other, expectations that changed without notice. deadlines that appeared intentionally unrealistic. Whether these were accidents or something more deliberate remains unclear. But to Ethan, the message was unmistakable. The environment around him was shifting, and not in his favor. By March 2021, coworkers reported seeing a clear change in Ethan's behavior. He arrived earlier than usual. He left later. He avoided breaks. His once steady demeanor carried a visible weight. He double-checked his work, then checked it again. He apologized for things that didn't require apologies. Small, almost invisible signs of a man pushed far beyond the limits of quiet endurance. Then came the turning point. In late March 2021, Ethan confided in a trusted colleague, not with details, but with a quiet, exhausted statement. He wanted to resign. According to that colleague's later account, Ethan said he felt cornered, overmanaged, and increasingly uncomfortable in his role. He didn't provide specifics, possibly out of fear, possibly out of exhaustion. But he made it clear that he needed to leave for the sake of his well-being. He intended to submit a formal resignation within a week. But he never got the chance. Because the moment he began distancing himself from the internal pressures, Rebecca changed her approach. In the weeks that followed, she became unusually attentive. She stopped criticizing his time management and instead praised his commitment. She reduced formal meetings and replaced them with casual conversations. She brought him coffee in the mornings.
She offered emotional support, claiming she understood the demands he was under. And slowly, methodically, her behavior shifted from intrusive oversight to personal closeness. This psychological pivot left Ethan disoriented. He wasn't accustomed to such drastic changes in tone. He wasn't prepared for the emotional warmth that replaced months of pressure. And in that vulnerable space, a relationship began to form. No one knows exactly how it started. There were no public displays, no obvious signs, only subtle changes. Ethan arriving with a softer expression, Rebecca lingering near his desk a little longer, brief moments of quiet conversations in hallways. Whether it was genuine affection, manipulation, or something in between, remains a point of contention even today. But one fact remains consistent across accounts. Rebecca convinced Ethan not to resign. She told him, according to internal notes later reviewed by investigators, that the company needed him, that he was indispensable, that leaving now would ruin long-term opportunities. She insisted that his frustrations were temporary, solvable, misunderstood. She positioned herself as his supporter, his advocate, the one person he could rely on. And Ethan, exhausted and overwhelmed, hesitated. He paused his resignation. He decided to stay a little longer, just to see if things would improve. But they didn't. In fact, they only worsened. Daniel's micromanagement became bolder, deadlines grew tighter, expectations became inconsistent, and Rebecca's emotional closeness slowly blended with the same control she once exerted professionally, a mixture that created confusion, guilt, and attachment all at once. Coworkers noticed that Ethan's mood shifted dramatically during this period. Some days he looked optimistic, other days drained. Some mornings he appeared energized, as though comforted by Rebecca's new support. Other mornings he looked hollow, as if wrestling with something he couldn't articulate. He was caught between pressure and affection, between mistrust and dependence, between the instinct to leave and the guilt of disappointing someone he believed cared for him. This psychological tug-of-war stretched on for weeks, pulling him tighter, pushing him closer to a breaking point he didn't see coming. By April 2021, Ethan's world had become a maze of mixed messages, shifting loyalties, and escalating expectations. His desire to resign resurfaced. He planned to take a short break. He mentioned needing time to think. he never got the chance. Because just as Ethan prepared to reclaim control of his life, the events leading to his disappearance quietly began aligning. A pattern of tension, a web of pressure, a series of emotional threads tightening around him. Threads that, within days, would converge into the final hours of his life as the world knew it.
By late April 2021, the tension around Ethan had become impossible to ignore. His coworkers described him as present but distant, quiet but thoughtful, moving through the office with a heaviness that didn't match his usual rhythm. And yet, he continued to work, diligently, patiently, determined to finish a complex system update that had consumed his time for almost 3 weeks. The day that would become the last anyone saw him began like any other, a Thursday. A day filled with deadlines, messages, requests, expectations. A day so ordinary that no one realized its importance until much, much later. Ethan arrived at the office early that morning, carrying his backpack, his usual thermos of coffee, and a subtle exhaustion in his posture. He sat at his desk, reviewed his tasks, and typed steadily through the morning. Colleagues noted that he appeared calm, almost peaceful, as though resolved about something privately, something he hadn't yet shared. Around midday, employees saw him entering a long internal meeting. The details of that meeting remain fragmented, reconstructed only through scattered notes, vague recollections, and a few time-stamped digital entries. What's known is that the meeting involved Daniel and Rebecca and a few scheduling conflicts that caused confusion among the engineering team. Witnesses later described Ethan walking out of that meeting looking drained, pale, and unusually tense. He returned to his workstation, put on his headphones, and worked silently for hours. As evening approached, most employees packed up and left, but Ethan stayed. He often worked late, this wasn't unusual, but on this particular night, something felt different. He seemed restless. He stepped away from his desk multiple times. He walked down the hallway, then returned. He checked his phone, then placed it face down on the table. At one point, he stared at a blank section of code for almost a full minute, unmoving, as though lost in a thought he couldn't escape. By 8:42 p.m., internal access logs show Ethan swiped into the server room, a place he frequented for maintenance, monitoring, and updates. He stayed inside for 23 minutes. The cameras outside the room captured him stepping out at 9:05 p.m., looking tired but composed. He walked back to his desk, packed his laptop, and zipped his backpack. Then, just after 9:20 p.m., he stood up, put on his jacket, and headed toward the lobby. This is where the timeline becomes chillingly precise. The lobby security camera shows Ethan exiting the elevator at 9:26 p.m. He adjusts the strap of his backpack, walks across the lobby floor, and stops briefly near the reception desk. Not to speak to anyone. No one was there, but simply to look toward the main glass doors. Some investigators believe he hesitated. Others believe he was thinking. But what remains certain is that he was calm, focused, completely unaware of what would follow. At 9:27 p.m., Ethan pushes open the glass doors and exits the building. Outside, a second camera shows him walking toward the parking lot. The timestamp reads 9:27:14 p.m. And then, silence. The next camera angle, the one facing the outer walkway, should have captured him moments later, should have shown him crossing the pavement, should have revealed the direction he chose. But instead, there is a 17-minute gap. A blank stretch of time where the footage simply does not exist. Not corrupted, not glitched, not frozen. Gone. The system shows no error messages, no malfunction reports,
no reason for the missing segment. For 17 minutes, between 9:27 p.m. and 9:44 p.m., Ethan disappears from the digital record. When the cameras resume, the walkway is empty. No Ethan, no movement, no evidence that anyone passed through. What happened in those 17 minutes remains the most haunting question of the entire case. Investigators later analyzed the system dozens of times, reviewing metadata, access logs, backup files, server indexes. Nothing explained the gap. Nothing indicated tampering. Nothing revealed a malfunction. It was as if the cameras simply closed their eyes and reopened them to an empty scene. What we know next comes from outside sources, not from the workplace. At 11:03 p.m., when Ethan still hadn't returned home, his brother sent him a message.
It went unread. At 1:14 a.m., his phone's location signal went dark. Not turned off, not lost, just dark, as though the device had ceased transmitting entirely. By Friday morning, his family knew something was wrong. Ethan had never missed a scheduled call, never ignored messages, never deviated from his routine without explanation. At 7:32 a.m., his sister contacted local authorities to report him missing. Meanwhile, his workplace, unaware of the brewing crisis, continued as normal. Employees arrived, made coffee, checked emails, and assumed Ethan was simply running late. But by midday, messages from his family began circulating. Calls were made, questions were asked, and slowly a chilling realization settled over the office. Ethan never made it home the night before. Security footage was requested, access logs were reviewed, and the 17-minute gap was discovered for the first time. Coworkers described the atmosphere as surreal, unnerving, and unlike anything they had ever experienced. People whispered in hallways, speculating quietly, afraid to speak too loudly. Some believed he had left voluntarily. Others believed something terrible had happened. Rebecca, according to several accounts, appeared distressed, visibly shaken, anxious, pacing through corridors as investigators began arriving. Daniel remained mostly silent, detached, monitoring the situation from a distance. By evening, news of Ethan's disappearance reached local media. A missing persons alert was officially issued. Search teams began canvassing nearby neighborhoods, parks, trails, parking structures. Nothing was found. Not a footprint, not a personal item, not a trace of disturbance near the building. It was as if Ethan walked into the night and dissolved into the air. His family waited for answers that never came. His coworkers replayed the footage endlessly, searching for details they might have missed. Investigators revisited every second of available footage, every log, every message, every trace of digital activity. But the truth remained hidden inside that 17-minute void, a void that swallowed the last known moments of Ethan Cole. The moment his life, his future, his presence simply disappeared. In the days following Ethan Cole's disappearance, Palo Alto investigators launched a full-scale inquiry, unfolding layer by layer, a case that quickly proved far more complex than anyone expected. What began as a missing persons search soon escalated into a deep forensic dive into the inner workings of a workplace filled with pressure, contradictions, and unexplained digital inconsistencies. The first focus was Ethan's final hours. The missing 17 minutes of security footage became the centerpiece of every discussion, every strategy meeting, every attempt to reconstruct his movements. But while that absence was troubling, it was only the beginning. When investigators pulled internal access logs from the office system, something immediately stood out. There were entries missing, not erased in a clean, deliberate way, but subtly altered, overwritten with partial data.
leaving behind fragments that didn't align with the company's automated logging structure. It was as if someone had attempted to adjust the records without fully understanding the system's complexity. The logs showed Ethan entering the server room at 8:42 p.m., but the metadata attached to that entry carried inconsistencies. Different time zone offsets, mismatched formatting, and a signature indicating the file had been manually accessed after his disappearance. Further analysis revealed a second anomaly. A portion of internal emails tied to Ethan had been deleted, not from his inbox, but from the company's centralized archive, a place only a select few employees had access to. Among the missing messages were several exchanges between Ethan and senior manager Daniel. The remaining fragments hinted at disagreements over project expectations, workload distribution, and timeline pressures. But the most concerning missing correspondence involved Rebecca. Dozens of emails that should have been routine HR communications were simply gone. Investigators later recovered partial backups that revealed abrupt shifts in tone, from supportive to disciplinary, from encouraging to corrective, hinting at an inconsistent and emotionally charged dynamic between the two. But without the full threads, the intent behind those messages remained blurred. The deeper investigators dug, the clearer a troubling picture became. Inside the workplace, Ethan had been navigating not just technical pressure, but a web of interpersonal tension. Interviews revealed patterns of coercion, micromanagement, and emotional entanglement that blurred boundaries and created confusion. Coworkers described Rebecca's behavior as over-involved, controlling, and emotionally unpredictable. Some recalled moments when she appeared supportive, even protective of Ethan. Others recounted incidents where she reprimanded him privately for unclear reasons. Her influence, they said, was increasingly difficult to understand. Daniel, meanwhile, was described as assertive, demanding, and sometimes irrationally intense about Ethan's work. Witnesses noted that he frequently questioned Ethan's decisions in ways that seemed less about performance and more about authority. During interviews, investigators noticed something else. Several employees hesitated when discussing the relationship between Rebecca and Daniel. There were implications of professional overlap, shared decision-making, back-channel conversations. Some claimed the two were unusually aligned in their treatment of Ethan. Others referenced whispered rumors that Daniel's father, who had long-standing connections in local business circles, occasionally influenced internal decisions behind closed doors. None of these claims were confirmed, but they became essential threads in the investigative web. When investigators requested external server audits, more irregularities surfaced. Key documents tied to resource allocation, project deadlines, and internal evaluations were accessed during unusual hours, often late at night, often from devices linked to administrative accounts, often without corresponding physical access logs to show who was present in the building. These unexplained logins raised immediate concern. They suggested a pattern of covert activity, or at the very least, an attempt to modify records quietly away from the eyes of regular staff. As digital forensics continued, financial inconsistencies emerged. Not theft, not fraud, but unexplained budget adjustments linked to internal initiatives that overlapped with Daniel's projects. Large reallocations made quickly with minimal documentation. Approvals that appeared valid on paper but lacked the proper digital signatures.
And several budget changes that involved the same internal systems Ethan had recently been tasked with maintaining. The question investigators asked was simple. Had Ethan discovered something he wasn't meant to see? Or had he become suspicious of something others were trying to conceal? Though there is no confirmed answer, the urgency of certain internal behaviors suggested an environment where transparency had begun to erode. The inquiry widened as investigators interviewed employees at all levels. Patterns began emerging. Multiple workers reported Rebecca's increasing control over Ethan's schedule.
Several cited tension between Ethan and Daniel in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. Some mentioned overhearing arguments behind closed doors. Others recalled seeing Ethan pacing through hallways in distress on his final day. Piece by piece, the puzzle grew darker. The more investigators uncovered, the more it became clear that Ethan had been surrounded by pressure, both professional and psychological. As evidence accumulated, authorities made a controversial decision. Rebecca Hale, Daniel, and Daniel's father were detained for questioning. Not charged, not declared suspects. Detained on the basis of patterns, digital anomalies, and witness statements that suggested the possibility, not the certainty, of involvement. The information publicly released was minimal. Authorities emphasized that the arrests were procedural, part of an ongoing effort to analyze every lead. But internally, the investigation was reaching a boiling point. During questioning, inconsistencies arose. Rebecca's timeline differed slightly from access logs. Daniel's recollection of his last interactions with Ethan conflicted with witness statements. Daniel's father denied involvement but provided an alibi that lacked independent verification. These contradictions, however troubling, were not proof. There was no physical evidence tying any of the three to a crime. No fingerprints, no DNA, no eyewitnesses. Nothing concrete that connected them to the 17-minute camera gap outside the building. And after 72 hours, all three were released. Authorities cited lack of physical proof, lack of direct involvement, lack of a definitive connection to Ethan's final movements. The release created shockwaves inside the company, across the community, and especially within Ethan's family. To them, the investigation felt both close to a breakthrough and impossibly far from answers. Digital anomalies remained unexplained. Deleted emails remained missing. Altered access logs remained suspicious. And the 17-minute camera gap continued to loom like a shadow over every unanswered question. The case was no longer simply about a disappearance. It had become an intricate maze of pressure, control, suspicion, and silence. A maze where every corner revealed new inconsistencies, and every inconsistency hinted at something deeper beneath the surface.
As weeks turned into months, the investigation into Ethan Cole's disappearance shifted from urgent search operations to a long, meticulous examination of competing theories. The case, once considered a straightforward missing person incident, had evolved into one of the most perplexing mysteries in recent Palo Alto history. A disappearance without a struggle, without a message, without a trace. And in that vacuum of certainty, theories emerged. Some grounded in evidence, some shaped by contradictions, some driven by the eerie silence surrounding Ethan's final moments. No single explanation fits perfectly. Each contains pieces of truth and pieces that fall apart under scrutiny. But together, they form the landscape of possibilities investigators continue to navigate. A landscape as fragmented as it is unsettling. Theory 1. Coerced disappearance. One of the earliest theories centered on the idea that Ethan may have been pressured, emotionally, psychologically, or professionally, into leaving on his own. Investigators noted the patterns of workplace pressure, inconsistent management, and increasing control over his schedule. They noted his private desire to resign, followed by Rebecca's sudden shift to emotional closeness. They noted the alternating cycles of support and strain he endured during his final months. Under this theory, Ethan left the office willingly, but not freely, not by choice, but through subtle coercion.
Some investigators pointed to the deleted emails, suggesting these communications may have contained warnings, threats, or emotional manipulation. Others pointed to the 17-minute camera gap as a window in which he may have been escorted off the property, perhaps under the guise of a private conversation or an urgent request. But even if coercion were involved, why hasn't Ethan resurfaced? Why no transactions, no communication, no digital footprint? The absence of any trace makes this theory plausible, yet incomplete. Theory 2. Planned escape. Another possibility, debated heavily among analysts, is that Ethan planned his own disappearance. Supporters of this theory point to his months of emotional exhaustion, his intent to resign, his sense of being cornered, and the pressure that had been steadily increasing around him. Some believe Ethan may have reached a breaking point and chosen to escape the environment entirely. The 17-minute gap could have been intentionally orchestrated, a quiet time departure, a quiet exit from a life that had become unbearable. But this theory raises immediate contradictions. Ethan left behind his bank accounts, his savings, his laptop, his personal devices, upcoming plans with his family, unfinished messages, and every possession he relied on. There were no withdrawals, no travel purchases, no reported sightings, no online activity, and no indications of a man preparing to start over. Ethan was methodical in everything he did. Leaving behind everything, without a plan, without money, without resources, does not align with his personality. If this was an escape, it was one executed with absolute silence. Too silent, some say. Theory 3. Accidental death followed by panic. Some investigators considered the possibility of an accident, perhaps in the parking area, perhaps during the missing 17 minutes, followed by an attempt to cover it up. This theory stems from the camera gap, the incomplete access logs, and the altered digital records that surfaced later. The premise is simple. Something went wrong, someone panicked, and instead of reporting it, they attempted to erase parts of the timeline. But this theory struggles against physical evidence. Extensive searches found no signs of disturbance. No blood, no personal items, no damage to nearby structures. Nothing. Every inch of the parking area was examined, and not a single trace suggested an accident occurred. Without physical evidence, this theory remains speculative. Theory 4. Internal cover-up. This is the theory that ignited public attention. After the arrests and subsequent release of Rebecca, Daniel, and Daniel's father, speculation turned to the possibility of a coordinated internal cover-up. This theory leans on deleted emails, altered logs, late-night administrative access, financial irregularities, contradictory statements, and the unusual influence Daniel's father allegedly held. Supporters of this theory argue that Ethan may have uncovered something, a financial inconsistency, an unauthorized system change, a misallocation of resources, and in doing so became a threat. The missing camera footage is often cited as the most disturbing element. How does a 17-minute gap occur without a trace of system failure?
Who had the ability to alter logs without tripping automated alerts? Who accessed the archives after Ethan disappeared? These questions remain unanswered. But it's important to emphasize there is no physical evidence connecting any individual to Ethan's disappearance. Only patterns, only inconsistencies, only shadows. Shadows that investigators continue to examine with caution. Theory 5. Abduction. Though less popular internally, the possibility of abduction has not been dismissed. Ethan's disappearance was clean, silent, immediate, without physical struggle. Supporters of this theory point to the missing camera footage, the sudden drop of his phone signal, and the complete lack of digital activity afterward. They argue that an external party, unknown to Ethan, may have intervened in that brief window of time, capturing him between the two camera angles. But even this theory raises questions. There were no unusual vehicles identified nearby, no strange license plates, no witnesses reporting suspicious activity, no signs of forced interaction. If someone abducted Ethan, they left no trace, none at all. And that level of precision is rare. Theory 6. Whistleblower retaliation. Some investigators quietly considered a darker possibility that Ethan had discovered internal wrongdoing, attempted to speak up, and faced retaliation. This theory draws heavily from financial anomalies, late-night access to internal systems, a pattern of subtle intimidation, and witness testimonies describing escalating workplace tension. If Ethan had become aware of something damaging, financial misconduct, internal deception, or administrative manipulation, he may have become a liability. Under this theory, the camera gap was not a coincidence, but a necessity. Yet once again, the theory falters against the one constant in this case, the absence of direct evidence. Without physical proof, this remains speculation. Contradictions and unanswered questions. What makes Ethan's disappearance so haunting is not just the lack of answers, but the abundance of contradictions. His last day timeline is precise, until it suddenly isn't. His access logs are consistent, until certain entries become irregular. His email history is complete, until entire threads vanish. Witness accounts align, until critical details diverge. Major contradictions include mismatched alibis among key individuals, digital inconsistencies across administrative accounts, conflicting recollections of Ethan's final meetings, changes in the tone of private communications, unexplained deletion of structured data, and the 17-minute camera gap that no one can explain. If Ethan walked away willingly, why erase emails? If he was harmed, why leave no physical trace? If his disappearance was orchestrated, why is the evidence so fragmented? And if it was accidental, why hide anything at all? These contradictions form the beating heart of the case, a maze of possibilities that continue to collapse into one another, never settling on a single truth. The unresolved core. No matter which theory you follow, no matter how convincing one path seems, every explanation eventually runs into the same wall. There is no body, no eyewitness, no verified departure, no verified arrival, no physical evidence. Only a moment in time where a young engineer stepped out of a building and vanished into a silence that has lasted for years. A silence filled with theories, inconsistencies, and unanswered questions. A silence that continues to define the case of Ethan Cole.
In the years since Ethan Cole walked out of his office for the last time, the case has settled into a place that is both deeply quiet and endlessly unsettling. A space between tragedy and uncertainty. A space where answers should exist but never seem to appear. The official investigation remains open. The files remain active. Ethan's name still sits in public records as missing, unresolved. But the momentum that once drove teams of detectives, digital analysts, and forensic specialists has slowed. Not from disinterest, but from the stark reality that no new evidence has emerged. Not a single clue, not a single sighting, not a single lead that held weight for more than a few hours. Ethan did not resurface. He did not contact anyone. He did not withdraw funds. He did not travel under any known identity. For all practical purposes, it was as if the world swallowed him whole. His family continues to live with that silence, a silence that stretches across birthdays, holidays, anniversaries, each one a reminder of the last time they spoke to him, the last time they saw him, the last moment before their lives split into a before and an after. His mother still keeps his childhood room exactly the way it was. A framed photograph on the dresser, a stack of books beside the bed, a poster he hung when he was 14, slightly faded, slightly peeling from the wall, untouched since the day he left home for Palo Alto. Sometimes she sits on the edge of the bed and runs her hand across the quilt, as though touching something he once touched will bring him closer. She says she can still feel him there, in quiet memories, in the hum of the house, in the simple things that used to define their everyday life. His father, quieter in his grief, spends late nights reviewing articles, case notes, online discussions, searching for theories, angles, possibilities that investigators may have missed. He built a timeline chart that spans nearly an entire wall, colored strings linking dates, locations, statements, and potential leads, a personal map of the unknown that has not expanded in years. His siblings have aged in the shadow of uncertainty. They navigate their own lives while carrying a question that has never been answered. What happened to their brother? Where did he go? And why did the world fall silent around his disappearance? Friends still describe Ethan in the present tense. They speak of who he is, not who he was. And maybe that's because acknowledging the alternative feels too final, too cruel, too incompatible with the gentle memory of the person they knew. But the office where Ethan worked, that place moved on. Not instantly, not comfortably, but inevitably. Months after his disappearance, the atmosphere in the building remained heavy, hallways quieter, conversations shorter, employees avoiding the stretch of lobby where he was last seen. Some desks were rearranged, some team structures changed, and eventually new hires arrived who never knew his name, never heard his voice, never saw the brilliance that once powered entire systems. Yet, despite the passage of time, there remains an unspoken awareness among those who were there that something inside the building changed the moment Ethan vanished. A disconnect, a fracture, a lingering sense that details of that night remain incomplete. Even today, certain former employees avoid discussing the case, not because they are involved, but because the memory carries weight. A weight made of unanswered questions, blurred timelines, and an emptiness that feels disproportionate for a disappearance so clean, so silent, so profoundly unresolved. For investigators, the mystery remains one of the strangest cases they've handled. They are trained to follow evidence, to trace patterns, to uncover truths hidden beneath surface-level chaos. But Ethan's case offers none of that. It provides fragments without context, anomalies without explanation, and a timeline broken by a gap that technology cannot justify. Without new evidence, the case became a cycle of reanalysis. Files reopened, re-examined, compared against new forensic standards, only to reach the same void every time. The 17-minute gap. The altered logs, the missing emails, the sudden drop of Ethan's phone signal, the absence of physical evidence in the parking lot, the absence of struggle or witnesses, the coworkers whose statements never quite lined up, the way pressure closed in on Ethan from all sides in the months leading up to his disappearance. These pieces form a puzzle that refuses to resolve. Every few years, a new detective is assigned to the case. A fresh perspective, a renewed sense of determination. But each one eventually encounters the same problem.
The trail ends before it begins. There is no point of conflict, no sign of departure, no indication of intent. Just a man stepping into the evening air and vanishing as though pulled into a world no one else can see.
Ethan's disappearance has become a quiet ghost in Silicon Valley, a reminder that behind the glass walls, the cutting-edge innovation, the relentless ambition, there are human lives caught in the pressure. Lives that can bend, lives that can break, lives that can be overshadowed by forces they never expected. In the years following the incident, internal changes were made, new protocols, new oversight systems, new digital safeguards. But even those changes carry a haunting undertone. They exist not because the truth was discovered, but because something unexplainable happened and no one wanted to risk it happening again. The people closest to Ethan hold on to one final belief, that someone, somewhere, knows more than they've said, that a detail remains unspoken, that a memory has been buried, that a moment of truth rests in the mind of a person who has chosen silence over revelation. Every year, on the anniversary of Ethan's disappearance, his family gathers in the same living room where he once sat with them, laughing, planning his future, promising to visit more often. They light a candle, they share memories, they talk about who he was and who he might have become. They do this because grief demands answers, and silence offers none. They do this because hope is a difficult thing to kill, even after years of uncertainty. And they do this because the world may move on, but a family never does. Ethan Cole remains missing. No body, no messages, no trail. Only questions suspended in time, drifting like smoke through the fragments of a life interrupted. A case without resolution. A story without an ending. A disappearance without a final chapter. But mysteries do not vanish on their own. Somewhere, behind the silence, behind the contradictions, behind the carefully constructed narratives, lies a truth waiting to surface. And as long as Ethan's name continues to be spoken, his story continues to be shared, his memory continues to be honored, that truth remains within reach. Because someone, somewhere, knows what happened to Ethan Cole. And silence, no matter how deep, cannot hold the truth forever. A final pause, a final breath, a final call to the viewer. Share this story. Keep his name alive, because someone, somewhere, knows what happened to Ethan Cole, and the truth is never meant to stay buried.